Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another installation of Flyleaf, our ongoing conversation with friends and authors with the Office of Archives Historical Publications Office. So today I'm really excited to have with us Cecelia Moore and Carole Troxler to talk about our recent publication of Carole's book about Sallie Stockard. They're going to go into a lot of detail about this. I'm just going to give the briefest introduction to both of them so I can not get in the way of their helpful discussion. So Carole Watterson Troxler is Professor Emerita of History at Elon University and co-author of Shuttle and Plow, A History of Alamance County, and Farming Dissenters, the Regulator Movement in Piedmont, North Carolina, also published with this office, and her most recent book about Sallie Stockard. And I'm glad to have Cecelia Moore with us. Cecelia Moore is retired university historian for the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She has an MA in public history from NC State and a PhD from Chapel Hill. She's the author of Federal Theater Project in the American South and co-author of UNC A to Z, What Every Tar Heel Needs to Know About the First State University. I think we have a great panel lined up for you all today. And with that, I'm going to step away and get out of the way of this great conversation. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Joe, and hi, Carole. And I want to say I really enjoyed this book. I welcome this book. I'm a little embarrassed to say that in all of the time that we talked about the first at UNC and mentioned Sallie Stockard, it never occurred to me to wonder what had happened to her after she had attended UNC. So I'm glad that somebody decided to write that because it's an important subject. I'm just going to ask you, I'm going to ask you just a couple of things so then you can talk about how you came to write this and everything. I think that what struck me in your introduction, you posed the question, how did it happen that the first woman to graduate from a major Southern people's houses? And that just really sort of set up the puzzle and the mystery of what happened to Sallie. And so I also was struck by, I think you pulled from some of what her family said and everything. You went back often to the word courage and she talked about courage. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about who she was and how you came to this subject.
Well, she was lovingly reared, pretty typical farm girl, substantial family, substantial land. The families on all sides had been in the North Carolina Piedmont and specifically in Alamance County since before the Revolution. She had an unusual experience as a child. Both her mother and her great-grandmother were very intelligent, literary-minded people. And they modeled for her a femininity that was married with children, but took in the whole world and thought about things beyond their purview and gave her, I think without anybody really being aware of it, possibly her mother was, gave her some inspiration for ambition, gave her the idea that she could do anything she wanted to do. And that wasn't true. That was not true. I mean, she had the capability of doing anything she wanted to do, but the social parameters are just, and she kept flying in the face of those things. And I like to think of her life as, or at least her adult life, as one of pushing against gates. There would be one gate and she'd push through that. But then there would be another gate. And the first gate hadn't given her any insight on how to get into the second gate. But she'd managed to push through the second gate. And then the same thing was true there, is she didn't know how to go further. So there are these like concentric circles of fences, each with a gate. And and her life story really is working through those gates. And I did not realize that until I had virtually researched the whole in her. I really did not raise the very good question that you mentioned of, okay, here's a woman who really starts out doing something special. What was her life like later? That did not occur to me. I knew her as, of course, the first woman to graduate from the University of North Carolina. And also living in Alamance County, I knew her as the first person to write a history of that county. It was her master's thesis at the University of North Carolina, which she turned right around and published. And of course, it's still around. It's not a good history by today's standards, but bear in mind that she wrote it in, between 1898 and 1900. And that's right after the first book of the first series of colonial state records became available. And she used them. As far as I know, she's probably the first person to use them and put them in print. So she had the chops for doing research, but there just wasn't much material. And so her book about Alamance County is largely based on interviews with families and information about families, which is very valuable for what it is. But it's been surpassed a couple of times now. And in the 90s, the Alamance County Historical Association contracted with me and with Dr. Bill Vincent, who is the director of the Alamance County Historical Museum, to do a new history of Alamance County, because 1999 was the 150th anniversary and we need a new history anyway. And so I did I did most of the book through the late 19th century, and Bill did a beautiful job with the late 19th and 20th century. And it was while I was researching for that, just looking for anything at all that I could find, that I came across some extracts of Sallie's memories of her childhood. And frankly, I would not have found them had we not been living in an electronic age, because back in the card catalog days, it would not have been listed under Sallie Stockard or Alamance County. But with the skimming and searching things that are available now, this was filed under Miscellaneous North Carolina Writers. Well, would I ever have looked in Miscellaneous North Carolina? But anyway, there it was. And, I was delighted and charmed to see it. I thought, oh my goodness, if the first person who wrote a history of Alamance County and who grew up in Alamance County wrote anything about her childhood growing up, there's probably something in here for me. Well, I didn't have to spend much time before I realized, yes, this is charming. And it's got some lovely things in it. But it's not really what she wrote. It's not anybody's raw memoirs. It's not anybody's polished memoirs. And what had happened is that her daughter, who I treasure, she's passed on now, but her daughter, I own, wanted to do something with these drafts of memoirs that Sallie had made over the years, really starting when she was about 70. And she kept working on them and rethreading them and redoing them, which is very rich for the historian, because every time she went back and entered something in the margin, it was coming from her later life as she was looking back at her childhood. So, here you get this whole kind of telescoping, or maybe kaleidoscope is a better term there. Well, I didn't know that existed, but I hoped that it did. And I got in touch with Ione, who was in her 80s at the time, and very lively and very encouraging. And of course, I asked her, is there more? And she said, oh, yes, I just took out a few things and I tried to make them presentable, she said, so that somebody would want to read them. And I gave them to the university as a tribute to my mother, which thank God she did.
Right.
I mean, no, I said, well, I sure would like to see them. And she encouraged me to take them. Now, between the time that we talked and the time that I actually got this big box of all of the stuff, Ione died. But her niece, who was settling her estate, the daughter of Ione's brother, Sallie had 2 children, a girl and a boy, and the niece had found our correspondence, and so the niece contacted me, and that's how I got them. And my first thought really was, this is a lot of memoirs, and it's all of a childhood. And it's all between about, she was born in 1869. So, the material started sometime in the 70s, between there and her something, and nothing beyond that, absolutely nothing beyond that. And I thought, well, this would be a nice thing to edit and identify the people that she mentions. And, that was my original idea. But then when I started reading all of those marginalia that were coming from later experiences, and I saw some bitterness and I saw some weird things in there, I thought, whoa, there's more of a story here than childhood memoirs. So that's when I decided that I would at least give it a try. Now, she was not an easy person to write a biography for, because she did not leave any material about herself after about 1909, and precious little after 1902. And so really the 2 best things that I had to go on are when she was in her 25 year period of just absolute misery. Well, she wasn't miserable, but the conditions were miserable. I don't think she was ever miserable, but the conditions were certainly miserable. And but during that time, the record that she kept, the one thing that she kept, was every year she would go to a post office and take out a money order and pay her life insurance premium for the sake of those 2 kids. Right. And so she had all of those money order receipts, and they were stamped, right there at the post office, wherever she was. So at least I knew where the local post office was, wherever she was. And I could start from there. Now, the other thing, and this is why I'm so grateful to her 2 children for making this possible. Ione, of course, for preserving and then passing along the material. But her son, Sallie's son, was the firstborn, and he started writing his memoirs, I guess, when he was about 40. He knew that his mother was doing this, and it probably was just a neat thing to do. And besides, the boy had an interesting life. Well, yes. So he reached back and he described some things from his very early childhood that he could still remember. And then he kind of made it chronological. He didn't say where they were all of this time because, he didn't remember what little town they were in, or what one-room school she was teaching in, or who she was working for as a housekeeper, or any of those kinds of things. It was quite a little adventure. And he was a good writer too. He got that from his mom. And so that gave me a leg up on some insight of what was going on in that family. So those two things were very valuable for me. And Scott, his name was Scott, he included some descriptions of some very interesting things, like, for example, a hog killing that they had when he was about 10, and Sallie was running the whole thing. And it was a circus, but they got it done. And then, oddly enough, in her memoirs, Sallie has an account of a hog killing when she was so this book, people, if you want to know.
There you go.
If you want,
I've got it too.
Yes, there are two hog killings in there. One is in the biography where I draw on Scott's description, and then the other is in the last 1/3 of the book is where I edited her memoirs of her childhood and identified the people, and really didn't change much of the way that she wrote it. So that's why there's two hog killings in there.
I guess we should tell people a little bit briefly about her sort of life and adventures, because after she finished up at UNC with the master's, and she wrote the Alamance County history, she published that, her thesis, and then she did another history for Guilford County. It's really a way to make money and try and make a living doing what she wanted to do. And but then she ended up leaving the state, and she and really to just try and do what she wanted to do. And I think one of the most remarkable things was she got married, and had 2 children, but they ended up in New Mexico at a time when that really was a long way away from here. And as you were talking about her son Scott's memories, because then they ended up separating, she and her husband, and so she raised 2 children on her own, trying to hold down teaching jobs in Texas and Oklahoma. And that's just kind of that part of the book is just really sort of fascinating, trying to
it is. It's sad in a way, but as I said earlier, she managed to stay on the upbeat. And the wonder is, and I'll just throw this out early on, the wonder is when situation, and of course the claim on the land was in his name, and so he just turned around and turned it over to one of his grown sons and went back to Arkansas where they had started out. And so there she was, homeless, 2 children, one of which she had born with nobody else in the sod house except the little boy. I mean, there was nobody. He was off somewhere.
Wow.
So there she was, and she taught. She got a job right away teaching, and kind of pulled herself through that, and started trying to get better and better teaching jobs, which really did not happen because they weren't there. And then there were obstacles for her getting and keeping jobs too, which is a whole nother frame of reference. But the wonder is, from teaching, she had enough money, and she had some cows. I saw her tax records. She had some cows. She would have sold her cows and bought some train tickets and come back to the North Carolina Piedmont. Her father was still living. That nice house was still there. Her sisters were there, and she could have brought those children back, and they would have had the security and the comfort and so forth. But her family had told her back before she went to Chapel Hill, in fact, while she was at Guilford, that she was getting too much education for any man to want to marry her, and that she was ruining herself as marriage prospect by making herself undesirable in that way. And she had just railed against that. I mean, that's sort of the beginning point with her. It's like, I'm going to do something myself, and I'm going to get married and have children like everybody else because I want both. I want both.
Remarkable.
That was the stance. That was the stance. And frankly, in her years at Guilford, she saw women who modeled that. They were teaching at Guilford and they had husbands and children. Or, you know, if not teaching at Guilford, one of the persons that she admired very much was a preacher. And, you know, all along Quakers had women as preachers. And this one was a real showstopper as a preacher. She also was very pretty and she had 2 little boys. So, I mean, you know, it's the young woman that Sallie was when she was exposed to this person. She, you know, she got that idea. So she keeps trying and just, she didn't want to go back and hear it all over again. We told you so. You can't hold a man. You know, you got this perfectly fine man. And she had brought him home after their son was born. She came back home on a little show and tell mission. She brought, you know, her husband. He was a nice looking man. He was a very prosperous farmer. And she brought this little cherubic baby, and she had a picture made, and this is in the book. She had a picture made of her and the baby. She's wearing her wedding dress. Right. And the little boy, this is like Madonna and Child. The little boy is not wearing a stitch of clothing. I mean, this is our drama queen here. Like, I am going to leave evidence in my home. She didn't take that picture with her. She left it in her home. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so anybody who came to visit, her sister Jessie, who, you know, admired and supported her very, very much. And Jessie had gone to Guilford also after Sallie did, and was had a good career as a teacher. You know, Jessie could show this off. So, but you know, after she's dumped in the wilds of New Mexico with these 2 little bitty children, there's no way she's going to come back. And she did not come back to Alamance County. She did not come back to North Carolina until she could come back and make a splash. And this was in the 1930s, after she had sort of established herself back in New York. From the time that she was abandoned until the time that she managed to get things together and get to New York. She was cleaning other people's houses. They were living in schoolhouses. Nobody wanted to rent to a teacher who had 2 little kids. Mm-hmm. And then as time went on, she, at first, I'm sure she let people think she was a widow. I mean, I just know she did. But then as the children got bigger and they knew they had a father, because occasionally in their early years, he would come to visit, not very often, but, you know, he would come to visit. And I know that because of the newspaper in the town where he lived would do all these things about somebody visited so-and-so or somebody. And they never said Mr. Magnus has gone to see his wife and children. They would just say, Mr. Magnus recently made a trip to Happy, Texas, which at that time I knew that they were at Happy, Texas. So she couldn't get away. And that became an issue, was when she had the best job that she had, which was at a really nice school in Amarillo, Texas. I mean, that's where she could have had a very good career. She taught there a year and then she was gone. Mm. I do not know why, but I know she taught there because there's that photograph that got the whole everybody outside, and it's not a good quality photograph. You've seen it, and so it doesn't show up all that well in the book unless you're looking at an ebook. You know, there's something to be said for the ebook. Right. You can zoom in on it, but you know, that was where given her personality and her preparation and so forth, it would have been a good place to stay. But I think maybe the issue of, you are familiar with the term grass widow. You know, the woman who's, of course, it originally meant something else and it's changed meaning over the years, but by the time people were applying it to her, it referred to any woman who was married and living apart from her husband for whatever reason. And that was her situation. And you didn't hire people like that to teach your little children.
Right.
You just didn't do it. And so when she lived in Canyon, Texas, after Amarillo, and she lived there for the longest time of any place. I think it was about 4 or 5 years she lived there. She actually bought 3 lots. She bought one. The first one, they just hauled a shack onto it. There had been some kind of like shacky barracks for construction workers who were rebuilding West Texas Normal College there in Canyon after a fire. And so after that was rebuilt, the college gave away these boards and pieces of shelter. And she got one of those and hired a hauler to take it to a little lot kind of out of the way. And they lived in that kind of lean-to situation for, 6 months or so. And she managed to buy a nice house in Canyon, which is still living. It's still standing. And
wow.
I have a picture of it in the book. I mean, it's just a cute little house. And it was a huge lot. And she had cattle and sheep there. Not sheep, hogs there, which is where the hog killing venture came. Another acre lot at some distance from there that she used exclusively for livestock and vegetables. And she continued to do housework for people. But when they first went to Canyon, they were living in a tent in the backyard of the family that she was housekeeping for. And the first time it snowed and, things were coming through the tent, the family insisted that they, move out of the backyard and that they sleep on their screened-in porch. So she and the 2 children ended up that time sleeping on the porch. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about roughing it. We're talking about really, really roughing it. And we're talking about a work ethic like nothing I have ever seen. One of my grandmothers was from Western North Carolina. And I'm not from North Carolina. But one of my grandmothers was 10 years younger than Sallie. And this woman worked like you would not believe. And I kept seeing things in Sallie that reminded me of my grandmother's attitude toward work, attitude toward a lot of things, frankly. And I never knew anybody that old. That grandmother was the oldest person that, I actually knew in my life. And so, that was kind of an interpretive link that surprised me. But yeah, she tutored children. She did all sorts of things. And I probably should tell you the reason that she picked Canyon as the place to go after it was pretty clear that she wasn't going to teach anymore. She hadn't given up because there were 2 places in Canyon that she could have taught. She was perfectly qualified to teach in that normal school. That's what she was trained to do. And the work that she did at Clark University after when she first left North Carolina, that was graduate work in education. And that was the kind of training that you took if you were going to teach in a normal school. So not only did she have that master's degree in history, which would have qualified her to do that, and frankly, the man who taught history at the normal school, And he had an undergraduate degree in history
Right.
something like that. So she could have taught history. She could have taught pedagogy, which is what they called it at the time, at the normal school. And she tried for that. But again, the whole family situation. The other teachers who were women at that normal school, and they were several, they were professional teachers. They did not marry, or if they married, they quit. I mean, that career path was open to people like Sallie, but the career path plus marriage was not open, at least in the South and West, or maybe some other things. And the schools there, for the most part, were not a bit better than the schools that she had taught in Alamance County. They were all pretty much on the same level, except in Canyon, the public school worked with the normal school, and it was a training school for the students at the normal college.
Right.
So it was an unusually good school. So there, her children were school age by this time.
Right.
And they spent 4 or 5 grades in that good Canyon school. And then she got a job with the state Department of Education in Austin. And that's an interesting little sideline, because here her life meshes with what's going on politically in Texas. And I won't get into all of that, but there is a new superintendent of education elected right after women got the vote in Texas. And despite of a very narrow window between their getting the vote and the registration deadline to vote in the next election. I mean, it was a tiny, tiny mirror.
Wow.
But this woman who had been a real leader in the Texas Educational Association, whatever the name of it was, and who was a very well-known educator, she got elected as the superintendent of education. And Sallie worked in the Department of Education, accrediting normal colleges, if you can believe that.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was good. But then the goal was to get out of the Southwest. And so from that point on, she was focused on saving her money. She sold the house in Canyon for a nice piece of cash, socked it away, did not get into it, and then finished out her time, so to speak, until I think about 1922. When she managed to get her son into a really nice boarding school in Massachusetts. That in his memoirs, and it's really interesting. This boy from Oklahoma, you're talking about culture clash. And they didn't like him at this hoity-toity school because he was a Southerner Westerner. That's what they called him. You're a Southerner Westerner. You don't belong here. But
I'm sure.
He toughed it out, and Sallie and the daughter moved to Manhattan.
Right.
And Sallie was a hotel maid, and she did some other jobs along those lines too, but she located herself in a tenement house where her daughter was in walking distance of a new public school, the first public school in New York for girls. And it was top flight. And her daughter did very, very well. So,
I think that's one of the remarkable things about her story. It sounds like it was a hard life, and it was definitely a hard life, but I encourage you, when you read the book, Sallie doesn't ever seem to have approached it as it being really hard. And that real dedication to making the moves so that her children would get a really good education. I think it just really showed, how far ahead she was thinking, and how important she knew that was.
She was besotted with education. That was her lodestar. She had seized it for her own self, and it had been her way out into the world. And she knew what it could do for her children, and she knew what the absence of a good education could do for her children. So yeah, that was the motivating thing. She was very focused on that, and nothing else really mattered. Nothing else really mattered. And I think that I ended up saying for her entire life that she had been a success by her own standards.
Mm-hmm.
Now, she didn't do what she started out to do. She wanted to have a marriage and family, and she wanted to have a successful career. She tried to do both. She did not do either. That's the simple truth. But she had a life of which she approved, and she had a life in which she had a good time. And she ended up, I think she always was a happy woman, but boy, when she settled on Long Island, and she lucked into getting 2 lots on Long Island, because it's just when they were starting, it was paradise.
Right.
It was just when the developers were starting with just the idea of building suburbs for the city out on Long Island, and even pricier things than that, of course. And their initial concern was to get people to come and build houses. So she had to agree to build a house worth a certain amount of money, which she did. And in case anybody still thinks that the North was nirvana for African American people, there was a required contract, and this was state law. There was a requirement in the contract that you would not sell it to an African American person.
Wow, yeah.
I mean, that's just the blank requirement. Anyway, that's what she did. So she got 2 lots side by side, built a house on one, farmed on the other one, and she didn't have to pay for the lots because she was going to go in and build a nice house and lure other people in. So she parlayed her way into a lot of things. She parlayed her way into those 2 lots, and then she had the money to build a house. So she was home free, and then she farmed, as she called it. I farm in a small way.
Right.
She had no car, but she had a garage in the house. And the garage was what her son called the egg factory. She kept chickens in the garage, and she sold eggs all the time, and she sold. Yeah.
It was interesting. I got to read this book during the pandemic for the first time, and watching the news about how so many women dropped out of the workforce during the pandemic because of lack of childcare and lack of support systems for women still being able to work and take care of a family. And it just seemed like, boy, 100 years and some things just really haven't changed much at all.
Yeah.
I mean, Sallie's life sounds very familiar. Yes. I'm sure for many women now.
For many women, it's a very familiar situation, or at least some aspect of it will cause a reader to go, ouch.
Right.
I did that, or I saw that, right. Or I endured that, or
yeah. So it's I don't know. In North Carolina, in an era that still needs much more histories written about it, and but yet a special person. And I think that it's just really, I guess I'll just say this too, before I don't know if there's other questions out there, but it also made me realize that UNC has done so little, really. We know the names of those first women, but those first cohorts of women, and we know a little bit about what they went through, but not really. We don't really know how hard it was.
No,
but we really don't know much about those women or their lives.
No. There were, as you're well aware, there were 4 women, 3 other women who were admitted to the university the same time that Sallie was. And I tried to follow up on the other 3. And I included in the book just, what I could find about them. One of them had an outstanding career. And I don't remember about the others, but I tried to follow it through. And, she sort of gets the glory because she was the first one to graduate.
Right.
And 1 or 2 of the others did eventually graduate. One, I think, kind of disappeared pretty soon. But yeah, and then I followed up on her contemporaries at Guilford. And at the women, and at the women who received the Bryn Mawr Prize at Guilford. There was the scholarship to Bryn Mawr that went to one woman student graduate from Guilford every year. And of course, Sallie wanted to get that. That would have been great, but she did not get that. But I looked into the other women who got that, over the years of maybe a 10-year period, and gathered some statistics of who got married, and if they got married, they dropped out of the workforce. That's the universal thing,
right?
So that was an interesting thing. Wow. But I'll have to tell you, it's the book. You can look at it one way, and it kind of makes you angry and sad that she wasn't able to do both things. In fact, she wasn't able to do either thing successfully. But on the other hand, her memoirs of her childhood are really evocative, and they really are. They're charming in some senses, and we all know this. And my introduction to the memoirs goes a little bit into what people who study self-writing, writing about the self, have warned and concluded about that. But even so, it's a time capsule into rural life in the North Carolina Piedmont in the late 19th century, and specifically into this county and into a very special part of this county. Now, she was not Quaker. Her family were Methodist, Presbyterian background, but they were saturated with the Quaker culture of where they lived between Snow Camp and Saxapahaw. And her one side of her family had been Quaker, going way, way, way back. So she was imbued with a lot of Quaker culture, and you definitely get some of that. And in many ways, that community had not changed for about 100 years before her lifetime. And another thing about, she has a lot of description of farming and cooking and material culture, and those sorts of things. And it's good for the authenticity of those memoirs that she had not continued to live in that community. And gone through the changes, because when you live in one place and it goes through changes, as every place does, you don't remember exactly what it was like when. Well, her memory of her early years, when it really hadn't changed, much since the Revolutionary period, she could zone in on that and not be distracted or confused by the way things had changed since then. So when she talks about farming things, which she was very, very interested in farming.
Mhm.
She really, in her childhood, she really admired her father because he was a very good farmer. She said he was in love with nature, which she was too. And being the oldest child, she was able to tag along with him and do, some of the work with him. So she was saturated with farming life, and her descriptions of some of the things that they did are things I've never encountered before.
Mhm.
And I think they really are little time capsules back.
Right.
For example, her father would plant a few hills of watermelons in with his cotton.
Hmm.
The reason was when the people were out there picking cotton, they could stop every now and then and have a snack and
Oh,
water from the watermelon. That was the treat.
how interesting. I
I
didn't
mean,
know that.
he didn't loiter the field with watermelons, but he put enough of them there so
Right.
that, and they did not hire anybody to pick their cotton. Sallie and her
Mm.
sisters picked the cotton.
They've forgotten.
But yeah, and of course her father picked cotton too. But I mean,
Right.
it was a family situation. And by the way, they had never owned any slaves in that family. There was a real,
Okay.
it was Quaker, yeah.
Oh, right. Of course.
Yeah.
Right.
So when they picked the cotton, they had this little refreshing thing, and then she had a friend who also picked cotton, and everybody bragged on her friend because she could pick an enormous amount of cotton, and people were always throwing that up at you. Well, why can't you pick as much cotton as so and so does? And then Sallie observed that whatever the girl's name was, her father did not plant any watermelons in his cotton fields.
There you go.
There's just there's a lot of stuff like that. It's just fun to
Right.
read, and I think people who have any kind of ties with Southern Alamance County are going to really get off on this, because she named a lot of people, and
Right.
I didn't take their names out.
Right.
What Sallie said about them, she didn't say anything bad about anybody. Well,
Right.
one or two bullies in school, I think she did, but other than that, she didn't say anything bad about anybody. And what she said about them may not have been true. Her memory could have played tricks, so I can't stand behind everything that Sallie says.
Mhm.
I'm
Right.
just for the memoirs, I'm just the editor. So
Wow.
but it was fun to write. Once I
Yeah.
went out west and found enough to track her and to get the kind of insight that I eventually got,
Right.
and then I knew I had a story, and I knew it was not going to
Mhm.
be simply an editing of her childhood. So
Well, and that's, I think, and we haven't mentioned that, but in addition to great records here in North Carolina that you referred to, there you found you did a lot of research in other archives and found stuff, and so that's quite a undertaking.
the best luck I had was on Long Island.
Hmm.
Not so much. I mean, there's no Sallie Stockard collection there. Anyway, they don't even know who she was. I had to tell them in the Long Island Studies Institute. Yeah, let me tell you about this girl. She became one of you. She's buried right here in Long Island. All that, but her son-in-law, in addition to his profession, was a very good photographer, and he put a lot of photographs into the Long Island Studies.
Oh, okay.
That's where I got the aerial photograph of her house and garden.
Right.
Yeah, and there are photographs of her and her family, because this is her son-in-law, and of course he has pictures. And I didn't put all of them in the book, but I mean, they're just some great pictures, which kind of suggest what her life was like, and
Right.
so that was really very, very good. And then in the Western states, there's almost nothing about Sallie herself.
Mm-hmm.
But what you have is tax records, and everybody had to pay taxes. So there's a certain amount of information in there. I combed the courthouses and the archives for any hint of a divorce, because the
Right.
children thought that there had been a divorce.
Mm.
There, and at the time, you couldn't get a divorce in New York,
Right.
so she couldn't have handled it from there. But no,
Yeah.
she got a divorce, and when her husband died, he commented that he didn't even know where Sallie and the children were.
Mm.
And he is, I don't want anybody to get the picture that he's really the bad guy in this.
Right.
He was, for one thing, he was about 25 years older than Sallie. He
Yeah.
already had an adult family who were waiting to inherit his substantial farm. And so when Sallie had a baby, then that was, that was a
Yeah.
flare. That was a big flare. And that's really why they went west. I
Mm.
mean, nobody has said that, but I mean,
Right.
I know that's why. And I did know from some interviews that that someone in the Arkansas area had done some interviews with that family. In fact, he and I credit. And Bob is a descendant of her husband, and he had looked into, what went wrong with the marriage and that kind of thing. But I think what happened was that once there was the anxiety of who's going to inherit the farm, and Sallie didn't
Right.
exactly fit into her husband's family. Let it be
Right.
said. She did not.
Yeah.
She did not fit. I mean, here's this young woman, and she thinks she knows everything, and she's going to tell people how to farm, and she's very fertile. So, who
Right.
knows what's coming along. So the husband sold his farm to one of his sons, and with the money, and this is so sad for him, he bought livestock, he bought equipment, he bought supplies. They got on the train, and they'd been reading all of these misleading books about how wonderful
Oh,
it was to
yeah.
homestead in New Mexico.
Right.
Well, the part of New Mexico that they were able to homestead in was not the part that had all the pretty farms. And it was just dry, barren land, and it had even been compacted by cattle drives over the
Mhm.
centuries. I mean, going back to the Spanish, they'd
Oh,
driven.
right.
I mean, it was not any place to farm. And he was a skilled farmer, but he farmed in Arkansas. He
Right.
farmed in the Delta. I mean, come on.
Right.
And so it whipped him down. It whipped him down. He'd already raised one family, and he was a worn out farmer. And it was just too bad. And
Yeah.
he gave up and just went back and lived basically as a hired hand on his son's farm that he had sold to his son.
Mm.
Yeah. Scott and I did spend one summer with him and the family that he was living with. This was the last summer, I think, when they were living in Canyon. So the children were early teenagers. And I know the reason that Sallie let them go there was that they could get good food, because Sallie had a
Mhm.
hard time keeping food on the table. And Ione in particular was malnourished.
Mm.
In fact, when she lived on that farm, she made herself sick eating raw potatoes and green onions. She just
Mm.
chomped down and got very sick. I know this from her brother's memoirs.
Right.
Yeah. And it,
Wow.
so there was real need there. I mean, these are growing teenagers. They need food.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. It's just remarkable.
Get that.
No, I know.
When she came back, I have to add this. When she came back to Alamance County for the first time, her little brother, one of two men named John Stockard, who have been sheriffs of Alamance County over the years. Well, this was the first John Stockard who was sheriff, and he was her younger brother. And I'm sure he got the interview with a Burlington Times News reporter. His name was Bill Lashley, and that's sort of a famous name here. Not for this man's sake, but that's sort of a well-worn name in Alamance County. Anyway, this Bill Lashley was a reporter, and Sallie just absolutely snowed him. She took charge of the interview. She was this high and mighty lady who had traveled far and wide and spoke all these languages, or read all these languages. She didn't speak them, but she did read a number of languages. I mean, she didn't tell him anything that wasn't true, but she made it sound like he was really somebody, and which she was, of course. But his headline was "Local Girl Becomes Famous Author and Comes Back to Alamance to Find It Not Changed at All," or she knows. Something like that.
Yes.
I mean,
I can appreciate that.
It was a priceless interview. Now, later on another trip back, a very skilled reporter did an interview with her and wrote, nothing about her hard times, but he was in control of the interview. Sallie was in control of his first interview, but that was just kind of
it's remarkable.
And there are things about Sallie, I will have to say, that are not admirable. She was as capable of making poor choices as anyone else.
Yeah.
And she became increasingly self-promotional over the years. That was part of her equipment. That was how she got on in the world. So, she was.
I think you did. Yeah, you did a nice job of showing her humanity that way. I think it's
good.
It's easy to sort of lose sight of the fact that people are complicated and they're not always
That's right.
as noble as they might wish to be. And so
I think people are going to read this and from time to time get the impression that, wait a minute.
Oh, right.
I mean, that certainly occurred to me a number of times. And I had to do a lot of thinking, at some point you have to put something on paper.
Right.
I had to do a lot of thinking about, how to conclude on that.
Right.
And somebody else might find it, might find a different judgment on that. So they're welcome to. There's plenty there to make a different sort of judgment on. But I'm in awe of her and her children.
Right. Her children as well. I know they did. Yeah. She did a good job.
She did a very good job.
Raising them.
They never knew anything about her growing up years. She never said anything about that when they were growing up. And so really her initial audience for her memoirs was her children. She wanted them to know what it was like. I think in one part of that motivation was she wanted them to know that her family were respectable, fairly prosperous people, and that, she had moved down a notch economically to lead the life that they knew her of leading. But they, their comment was, and I didn't know the son. He predeceased her, but I saw a lot of things that he wrote about his mother, because I had his correspondence when he was trying to find out more about his Magnus family, because his mother never talked about. She never talked about their father. She just, didn't want to say anything bad, so she didn't say anything.
Yeah.
Which left them, with this gaping hole. And
Sure.
Scott tried to fill that in right after she died. He went out to Magnus, Arkansas, and started looking up people. And he, he found some, and he continued to correspond. And he corresponded with a local genealogical researcher there for years. And of course, I had their correspondence. But what he kept saying about his mother is that she was about 75 years ahead of her time. And then her daughter said the same thing to me also. And what they were referring to there mostly was her teaching methods. Because she had gone to Clark University and she had studied under, well, he was the man who introduced Sigmund Freud to the United States.
Oh, okay.
Who brought Freud. He invented. And Sallie thought he was wonderful. And she bought into that, and it didn't work. It didn't work in Texas.
Sure, there was a lot there.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Is there anything else we should talk about it, or
would you?
I have to.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I have to say that while this picture of Sallie is the picture we all see, and it's an amazingly striking photograph of her.
Yeah.
Younger. I actually really appreciated the pictures you included of her as an older woman.
Oh yes.
Because she's really, those photographs are really striking as well.
They are. I've kept one on my mantle all these years, which is in the book. She looks very pretty. She's about 50. And if you look close, you can see all of the sunspots on her face and hands, which is still very pretty. And it's after she moved to Manhattan.
Right.
And I love that. And I even love the frizzy-haired one that's from the little paper that she edited.
Yes, I like that one too.
These heavy glasses and just frizzy hair.
Right.
Yeah.
Fine with that.
How much more time do we have? I'm oblivious.
I don't know.
It's 12:11. Have we gone over? I was going to read a part, and I guess it would take about 5 minutes from the memoirs, just to give. Are you sure?
Sure. I think so.
Somebody can edit it out,
Right. Okay.
All right. This is from her memoirs. And I have a little introduction, which I won't read. And I call this Plucking Geese with Expectations. One day in spring, I went over to Mrs. Boone through the tall oaks, over the old rail fence, and across the newly plowed fields. She was in her garden with flowers she had brought from her old home in northern Alamance County. And Sallie names the flowers, which I want. After our greetings and pleasantries, I told her I had my money ready to buy the geese we had agreed, an old goose with 6 young goslings for 60 cents. The goose was on her nest. She reached out her long white neck to warn us off. The little green goslings also reached their heads out as much as if to laugh at us. We put the goslings in a big basket with the goose over them and covered it all with my apron for me to take back home. Now, nobody knew what was the idea back of those geese. Who could I tell? Adages. No girl can have a beau until she has a feather bed. No maid may marry until she has 7 quilts of her own. End quote. I suspect this thinking too had been back of my desire to learn to weave. My father saw those geese and he almost swooned, didn't quite call for the camphor. He spat out his quid and reached into his pants pocket for a fresh twist of homegrown tobacco and took off a big bite. At last he spoke. In fear and trembling, I listened. Well, Sallie, the first time the wild geese fly over this house, those goslings will be big enough to hear them, and away will fly your pretty goslings Until then, they will grow up to be a bother to my farm, a whole lot of trouble. You will have to trot your legs off to keep them out of my corn and wheat fields. Then they will leave and you will lose everything. Just you watch out. I ought to make you take those geese back to old Mrs. Boone. So what was I to do? I did this. I found a wad of pine gum used for cuts and bruises and a little vial of turpentine, some strings, and the sheep shears. I had studied hard in a short time to do this, and for once I would act and be on time with my operations. With the shears, I cut off the first joint of one wing of each of the goslings. Then I poured on a few drops of turpentine, tied up the wings to keep them from bleeding so much, and daubed on the pine gum. Pine rosin would stop the bleeding. The goslings had sore wings for a while. The mother goose did not seem to know what to do about it all. Neither did I, but I kept a close watch every day until those bandages might be left off. Then each gosling had a knob on one wing. They dragged one wing for a long time, but they never showed any inclination to fly away with the wild geese. The geese grew to provide for my feather bed. Every 6 weeks in the warm weather, I called up my geese into the stable to pick those breast feathers. Covering my head with a cloth, as do the people in faraway India, I put a heavy cloth over a wash tub and got myself a chair. I had a good strong string for tying their feet. Sometimes the geese bit. Those long yellow bills can hurt, just pinching. And as each one was finished, I turned it out. With the stable door shut for an hour or more, I picked geese. Fit, flip, feathers and down flew with the squawking and quacking. It looked like it was snowing in that cow stable, and the geese looked like shorn lambs. After the first, they did not mind it. When it was all done, I gathered my feathers from that tub into a big sack. In a little more than a year, I had a big sack full. Then a big brand new striped bed tick full of goose feathers. It was not 100. Won't that many anyhow. Somehow by the time I had my feather bed, I had grown tired of the idea. In 2 or 3 more years, the bows began to come around. I guess the news of my feather bed went far. The plan had worked. And also, the plan had not worked. Like most of our hard work, it came to nothing. And then I'm going to, she talks about making a quilt. And then she concludes by saying, that fellow, that sweetheart with his proposal, was not forthcoming. Not for so long, not there at home at all. I refused to marry any of my kin. And there are indications elsewhere that there was some pressure to marry some cousins. I had pronounced ideas about that. Disappointed, discouraged, and hurt, I started out on another line of work and planning. I must have an education. I must get it for myself somehow. The Lord God of Israel had said, I will fight your battles for you. So I hid myself in my own little room upstairs to read the Bible through. I planned to read 3 chapters a day and 5 chapters every Sunday for a year, but I did not. I read it through in a few weeks and enjoyed it. I told nobody. If people knew about my reading the Bible, they would tell the preachers, who would be certain to annoy me, and they would maybe preach about it. Or some might think I might be going to die, or that I was getting too good suddenly. All that notoriety would be so unpleasant.
That's remarkable. Thank you for doing that. That's
Sure.
a good
Sure.
reminder. She really was a wonderful writer. So
Good writer. Yeah.
good writer. Well, I think maybe we can wrap up now. I don't know where Joe is. If we need to
Maybe I put him to sleep.
bring him back.
Well, it's been great to talk with
It
you.
has been. Thank you
really
so
has. And it's really an honor, Cecelia, to talk with someone who did what you did at the university.
Oh, thank you.
And
Thank
did
you.
it so well, because like other institutions, the university does not automatically write its history.
No, they don't. They don't look back much. They're not self-reflective very much.
No, they're
Institutions just
not.
aren't.
You have to go to some trouble. My husband, late George Troxler, did a fine history of Elon University, and everybody was very well pleased with it. But nobody would have dug up all that stuff if they'd been, focused on that thing. And they gave him a year sabbatical. They counted it after he retired, but it was in effect a paid year to work on that. And of course, it took both of us about 3 years to produce it. But that's that's
right.
normal. But it was very very wise of to make arrangements for to somebody to really do that.
I think it is. It's so illuminating for I think when I first started looking at UNC history from within, I didn't appreciate how much it was going to clarify why things were the way they were in the present, and yet it's like, oh, so that's why we never did that. Got it. And there's just so much to it, and it's very interesting. And I always found that the students almost always are fascinated by it. Not so much, administrators.
Well, but you're not really working for them. I mean,
no, it's really for the students. So
that's not your intellectual audience there. Well, when did you start doing that kind of thing for UNC?
I started it pretty much. I went back to school as an older person, so I was working on my PhD, and when I was working in the chancellor's office as a speechwriter, and so because I sort of became the only historian in South Building, the main administration building, even because nobody else in the building was a historian. Everybody started asking me university history questions, and so I had to go research things and learn about them, and that then just kept feeding into my own research too, which was related to UNC. And honestly, I really enjoyed it a whole lot, and there's so much that still hasn't really been explored or told.
Oh yeah. There must be, as long as it's been there. Good grief.
Right. And also then as we began to work on other issues around, later around renaming buildings and around race and all of that, I also realized that because local people kept telling me, you need to understand the community too. It's not just the university doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so I really then started learning Chapel Hill and Orange County history in order to understand what was going on. And that's still ongoing. I'm still doing that even though I'm retired, because it's really interesting.
Yeah, and it has a lot of potential for a broad readership too. I hope you continue with that and publish it so the rest of us can enjoy it. Yeah,
we'll see.
Excuse me. I'm flashing my Alamance Battleground.
I saw that
here from one of our state historic sites.
Historic sites, yes, I know. That's great. And and I am not from North Carolina, though I've lived here nearly 30 years now. And but as it turns out, I learned this after we moved here, I have ancestors from here. And I have ancestors who were in Alamance County and who were part of the regulator uprising. So in fact, Alamance County history is my history, even though I didn't know that.
Well, that's true for so many people whose ancestors moved to the South and West and had lived in greater Orange County for a generation or two. And, maybe some stayed here and others kept
some
moving.
Moved on.
But and
my family did. My ancestors moved eventually to Louisiana, which is where my family's from.
Yeah.
But
there is a place in on the Haw River in the town, what's now the town of Haw River, which started
Right.
out Trollinger's Crossing, Trollinger's Ferry, and
Oh,
Trollinger's
right.
Bridge. And it was one of the crossings of what we call the trading path network that
Mhm.
really goes back to pre-European. And then with the settlement coming in, it became a more established thing. And really, unless the water was extremely high, that was the main crossing of the Haw River. And you can stand on the bridge there and look down at an island. Now, these are not tracks from the 18th century, but you can look down. You can look down and see wide wagon tracks in that island where they crossed over.
Wow.
And that crossing, I'm quite sure of this, that crossing does go back to colonial times. And to
Mhm.
me, it's just almost a magical place. I love to stand there and look down at them who moved west or who maybe
Right.
lived here a while or maybe didn't stop here and just kept
Right.
going. This was their funnel. Right here, this
Yeah.
place in Haw River was
Wow.
their funnel. They
You'll
called
have to show me that sometime.
it,
I would love to see that.
I'll be glad to. Well, this has been lovely. Thank you
Okay, it
for
has been.
providing
Thank you
such
so
good
much.
questions. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you. And I hope people will get the book and enjoy the book. And I guess we need to wrap up now. I just got
Yes, we do.
the notice to wrap up. So, okay,
Okay.
great.
Good. All right. Goodbye.
Thank you, Carole. Bye-bye.
Sure.